Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm excited to be joined with Anu Sharma, the founder of Millie Clinic, which is working to build better maternity care for mothers across the country. Anu was previously a founding executive of Bird Health, and I appreciate you taking the time. As I was learning more about Millie Clinic and yourself, I learned that this was really born out of a problem that you're solving for is born out of a personal experience. So I was hoping we can start there and kind of better understand the genesis of it, and then focus more on the healthcare side and problems that exist today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Kanal. This is something I've been looking forward to. So, yeah, let's start with, kind of how this all kind of came to be. And so I have a long background in health innovation, and I happen to come from a family of physicians. And so, I certainly wasn't a stranger to healthcare. But I found myself, kind of contemplating pregnancy, but at a point in my life where, I didn't necessarily, have a great ovarian reserve. And so I kind of went down the fertility path, which involved 6 rounds of failed fertility treatments, which was a bit of a harrowing process, but ultimately a natural pregnancy. And, it was one of those things where, you've had a long journey to get to that point, and you think the hard part is over. And so, it's going to be smooth sailing from there on. But that's not kind of what I experienced. I, kind of went through, what a lot of people do, which is, a pretty one-dimensional experience from a care standpoint, which is really constructed around a series of clinical visits, which are all about labs and scans, where you are on the other side as a patient really kind of going through a pretty transformative experience, and you have needs around information and education and supplementary care and emotional support. And you're really kind of constructing your journey, as you're moving through it. And it creates for, a lot of anxiety and just kind of a sense of disempowerment, on the one hand. But my general expectation was that if I, had done a good job in terms of, picking a healthcare provider that was highly regarded, I was going to be in good hands, at least for the clinical portion of that experience. But what happened was that I developed gestational hypertension at week 38. I ended up having to be induced 10 days early. I went through 2.5 days of labor, an unplanned C-section, and I nearly hemorrhaged in the OR. And then I, spent 3-4 days recovering post-op, as is typical following a C-section, and was discharged home with instructions to return at my standard 6-week visit. And, I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but, it certainly, in hindsight, was the very definition of a high-risk pregnancy. And it was a little surprising that, there wasn't really any attempt to kind of, check in to see, how I was going to be doing. And sure enough, I developed postpartum preeclampsia, which I self-diagnosed at home. And I ended up walking myself back into the ER 36 hours later from being discharged with a 5-day-old baby at home. And, it was one of those things where when I showed up, I was on the verge of a stroke, and I had ended up kind of saving my own life. And, it was sort of the counterpoint to my kind of, experience during pregnancy, which was that, it's sort of a, kind of a fairly unsupported journey, but I also just kind of came to see that the care model itself was pretty broken. There's a lot of pregnancy really happens between visits. And the postpartum period is when there is the most vulnerability from a health risk standpoint. And that's kind of, where the system basically kind of leaves you. And so it just kind of felt to me that the care episode was incomplete, and missing an experience there, but also just kind of missing entire chunks in terms of, where care was needed. And the other sort of, part of all of this was just, I didn't really feel like there was any discussion from a mental health standpoint through any of it, and I was dealing with a lot, kind of just going through pregnancy. And so, yeah, that was kind of, the genesis of Millie, where I was like, there must be a better way to do this. And when you start to kind of look at models that exist elsewhere in the world, there are good examples. And so we're really kind of, building something different.
And that's a very harrowing story, and it's glad you're okay, but it's not, unfortunately, that's more common than it appears. This seems like a very scary pregnancy story. I think we all need to hear about a lot of the good stories that happen as a result. Can you talk about how common this actually is? not only on the fertility side, but even that postpartum area and the episode of care that you mentioned. Could you just talk a bit about kind of what that looks like at a national level too?
Yeah, I mean, the statistics are not good. The U.S. Has the worst, outcomes from, from a maternal mortality and morbidity standpoint compared to any other high-income nation. We also have very high rates of C-section. They've come down, but they're still incredibly high. We have, a pretty high number of preterm births and NICU stays. The latest statistics sort of would indicate that 1 in 8 women experience perinatal anxiety and depression. So all in all, it's not a great place necessarily to kind of, go through pregnancy. And, so that's kind of, I think things we have known for a long time. And there is, on top of all of that, a lot of sort of, statistics that point to health inequities. And then there are issues in many parts of the country around access to care. There's maternity deserts, and all of this is particularly kind of jarring from the standpoint of what's really going on in the macroscopic picture. We have fairly significant shortages from an OBGYN and midwifery care perspective, in just a supply of care providers. And so, if you're going through the pregnancy journey in the U.S., there is a lot that you should be mindful of, as a patient, as you're thinking about where you're going to be getting care and the type of care experience you're going to be going through.
And what are the structural shortcomings, like from a history of healthcare, given you've studied the space, spent a lot of time on the consulting side, and then kind of building companies? Is it on the payer side, provider? Because the health system failing you at that point in time where you had to walk back in 36 hours later is probably happening with a lot of mothers who have never actually been in the healthcare ecosystem before or can't afford the highest quality of care. So can you talk a bit about the structural problems that exist today or have existed, and then maybe how Millie Clinic is beginning to solve some of those?
Yeah, I mean, from a structural standpoint, there's, I would say, 2 or 3 things that I think really kind of, sit behind these statistics. The first I would say is, patients are sort of putting their sort of stock in the hands of care providers and assuming that the care model is sufficiently designed to care for them. But I think, what truly happens is that, you're not really bringing the patient into the care, into the care journey. And so they don't really have a great sense in terms of, where the warning signs might be, and how to do, how to surface them to their care provider and then be able to kind of, advocate for their needs as they kind of move through the experience. So I think that's kind of, I think one of the core issues as to why things happen. It's often associated with delayed care. So that's, I think, a pretty profound thing. I think the other thing from a structural standpoint is that, there are most of, I think, and this has been true of my experience, just in healthcare in general, like, a lot of healthcare is built for the 80% of the times things are going to go fine, and that's how reimbursements are structured as well, for the most part. And so, typically when you think about, how a healthcare operation is designed, it's a function of, what reimbursement will cover and operationally what's the most efficient thing for the health system to do. It's not necessarily patient-centered care. And so if you find yourself, in the edge case situation, at that point, it's really kind of, incumbent on you to identify your need and then walk yourself through it. And then kind of going back to the first point I made, if you don't know how to do that, it's just going to be one of those things where hopefully you show up on time. Hopefully the health system that you're in, has protocols in place, to be able to kind of, deal with that. And I think I would say that I think that in a large part, I think the reason why I ended up getting, good outcomes in the end was because I'm in California, and California has done a lot over the years, to put in place, programs across many participating health systems that are part of the Quality Collective here, to deal with things like preeclampsia and whatnot. And that's not true around the country. So where you live and what those health systems, are sort of built to do makes a huge difference, in these edge case situations. And then thirdly, I think from a reimbursement standpoint, I would say that there's, the way that it's sort of structured today is that, it's really designed to cover the clinical episode, so everything else that I kind of talked about in terms of, mental health, lactation support, pelvic PT are not actually sort of, the standard part of the care episode bundle today, right? And you deal with sort of a patchwork of putting together, provider networks, that kind of supplement the core pregnancy experience. And not all providers accept insurance, right? And so you're kind of then dealing with, okay, who does? Can I use my HSA and FSA dollars? Or you're sort of, you're in the world of cash pay, right? And a lot of that just kind of adds up for people. And so, so I think those are just some of the, some of the issues that kind of, go on at the practical level, as a patient kind of moves through this journey. And then kind of, more at sort of the bigger picture level, as I kind of mentioned, there are just structural constraints, when it comes to the supply of providers and the availability of healthcare in parts of the country, which may not have the density and it's hard to reach care, So, those are just kind of general issues that exist across the healthcare system, even outside of pregnancy, right? But yeah.
Those are massive issues. And I mean, it would be interesting to hear the 0 to 1 of Millie. You had a child, you went through this harrowing process, and then decided to go and build a company to solve this problem, which you can't find a more personal reason to start a company in this space, especially with such deep structural issues there. But what did the 0 to 1 look like for you in terms of saying, okay, there's the full journey, like you just mentioned. There's fertility, there's the point of care, there's postpartum, there's lactation consulting stuff. Where does Millie begin to play with all these structural issues that exist, and how you decided, okay, from 0 to 0.1, this is how I'm going to start to build and build a business in this space?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So, I mean, the way that we think about sort of the scope of Millie is from when you think about starting to try, and that really for us kind of looks like a preconception visit, and then once you do become pregnant, Millie is your prenatal care provider, so you get all of your pregnancy care, labor and delivery, postpartum care, and then we built a support system to take you through the first year, so we kind of covered the whole pregnancy episode, through the lens of, I think, the way that we see it as consumers, which is different from, kind of the healthcare sort of definition of a care episode, right? And so I think that's an important distinction, because what we're really building at Millie is, really looking at this as a whole person, larger kind of contextualized event, that someone kind of goes through, as opposed to kind of the narrow definition of, when you start needing clinical care and when that clinical care ends, right? And so the ecosystem that you sort of build to kind of do that, consists of many more points of support and, a lot more kind of, by way of really enabling the patient, through that journey. And so that's kind of, sort of the scope of Millie, but, we will layer in broader services as it relates to women's health. We do think about abortion care as an intrinsic part of maternity care. And I think in the sort of ultimate kind of definition of Millie, I think we're really kind of, gearing up to be a company that's designed around women's reproductive health and wellness, kind of through that phase of their life. And we will partner with health systems over time to bring the Millie model of care, to their populations. And so that's kind of, the direction we're building the company. And I think in the 0 to 1, it was just one of those things where we had to kind of make a decision early on, like, should we choose to be a platform, that's just sort of, wrapped around whatever the current experience kind of is. And there are many, many, many companies, that kind of do that, either as apps in the hands of patients or platforms, for progressive employers, and so on. And we just we did some beta testing, and coming from a healthcare background, I was like, yeah, this solves the experience layer, but it does nothing to move, the trajectory on cost and outcomes. And so, it's a nice supplement when nothing else exists, but the real need is around kind of fixing a pretty broken care model. And so, a lot of what we sort of try to solve for at Millie is not just kind of, building out that experience layer and integrating that into kind of your care experience, as you might kind of, expect of any 21st century sort of a company, but we've actually redesigned the care model itself, and for us, what that means is it's a collaborative, OB midwifery model of care, your care team and, the level of support sort of evolves as your level of risk evolves, but you have both. You're not left choosing between one or the other. We believe that makes a real difference when it comes to the level of medicalization of care. For what is otherwise a natural physiological event that many people go through, which sometimes might need medical attention, but not always. But also really kind of starting to think about, how do we bring mental health and patient, engagement and close feedback layers between that intervisit period, so that we have full visibility across the entire care episode itself, plus knitting all the other pieces together into one unified experience. So there's a lot kind of going on there, that really, I think, move the needle in terms of, just lowering the level of medicalization where it's not necessary, which reduces cost, but also, early detection and better management of the care episode itself, as it relates to complications that arise that are often addressable. 60% of them are, while creating a much more empowered experience, for people going through this journey.
Right. And I do want to spend more time on that patient journey and kind of those beta tests and things, but before we get in there, I think we should discuss it. I mean, the current political environment, it's sad that things like this can be politicized, but how do you think about building Millie, especially for high-risk pregnancies when an abortion is the only solution for some mothers at that point in time? How do you think about building a business such as this and that entire journey and kind of facing those geopolitical issues at the same time? How do you manage that?
I mean, it's a great question. So we are built to provide abortion care, and our care providers are still providing it. We will offer it. It's a natural part of the conversations that go on in pregnancy, right? And our general position on these things is, you might have an ectopic pregnancy, you may have complications. There's any number of situations that care providers and patients find themselves in, where it's the right thing to do for the patient and, from a medical standpoint. And if that's what was needed, to discharge, quote unquote, our duty of care as a provider, then that's what we would advise, right? And so, what that means is that, there are obviously going to be implications in terms of the markets that we choose to be in. And there are going to be implications in terms of, how we sort of, pick partners, whether those be health systems or otherwise, right? And so, because it's important for us to kind of, really build a vision for progressive women's health, women's reproductive health specifically. And I think, we're committed to doing it. And so, we can talk a lot more about, the specifics of all of that, but we agree with ACOG. I mean, yes, there's a political environment around us, but as a care provider, you have to be true to what a care provider is supposed to do, and that's what we are.
I think Millie is building towards this, right? But they might be a few years from now. But what is, you said progressive women's health, and then you talked about the structural issues from the payer, provider, health system, clinic side. What does progressive women's health in the U.S. look like from the perspective of an entrepreneur and kind of a health expert? What does that look like, and how should the entire system be structured around that group? And where do you want Millie Clinic to be playing within that ecosystem?
Yeah, so I mean, we're kind of bringing it to life in the next couple of weeks when our first clinic opens in Berkeley. Actually, everything that I described will be there. So it's and it will be covered by insurance. Starting day one, right? And so. Millie is a sort of company that takes time to build, right? Like it's different from the typical startup, right? In the sense that, if we were building an app or a platform, our natural trajectory would be put something out there, sort of hopefully it catches fire, you kind of go through your seed round, then you kind of do your Series A when you hit a certain revenue threshold and such, right? And so we're a little bit different, right, in that sense. And, we are a vertically integrated, care provider, with virtual offerings as well as in-person care in a clinic setting. And the model of care that I just described will be available to all of our patients, and so we don't see this as futuristic by any means. It's happening. It's literally, what we've spent 2 years building. And the way that we sort of brought it to life is, first of all, it's an interdisciplinary effort where we've had to bring together, kind of clinical leadership, on the team, as well as, strong tech, people who understand, what experience design and sort of, a brand in terms of, kind of how we connect and speak and look and feel, for, kind of a new generation of birthing families really kind of looks like, and bringing all that together in the context of, a fully integrated, kind of care journey, for something as complex as maternity, making room for things like abortion care, and having all of that covered by insurance, right, is not a small thing. So we've taken the time to do it, and we chose Berkeley, as our sort of first clinic site, which is an unusual decision to make at some level, for many people in the venture community, which is like, what? But it's because, kind of the Berkeley, Oakland area, is where a lot of families happen to live in the Bay Area, right? I would say it's twice the size of San Francisco. I live in San Francisco, but the East Bay, I think is kind of, home to many, many families. It's pretty underserved. We have a great health system partner, that we will lean on for, kind of more complex care needs, such as, genetic testing or advanced radiology or, just backup hospital support during labor and delivery, the facility from a delivery standpoint as well, right? So all of those things, and obviously the insurance coverage for all of the stuff, is just the model of, kind of, how we're going to do this everywhere that we are. Ultimately we've had actually in the last couple of weeks, a lot of interest from managed Medicaid plans around the country, health systems around the country, who kind of learned what we're doing. They're like, that sounds absolutely wonderful, and hard. And here we're like, yes and yes. But there is a real desire to kind of think about how we can kind of reach this, so, just to give you two examples, I mean, there's, a conversation around, could we potentially sort of, do what primary care has done, models like One Medical and others, where they've sort of become part of clinically integrated networks with health systems, where they provide a certain level of care, and then as acute care needs kind of increase, you sort of, move those over to the hospital. And I think the same can be done in maternity as well. I mean, 80% of pregnancies are low to moderate risk to begin with, right? And, but you can build that continuum of care in collaboration with the health system. And on the other hand, I mean, I'm having conversations around like, hey, could you take everything that Millie is doing, bottle it up and then kind of just bus it out into kind of, just rural parts of the country, literally like a mobile, like, kind of maternity clinic, even a mobile birthing suite, right? Just in parts of the country where that it's not practical or possible, to, really kind of build out like clinics because the volumes aren't there, right? And so, but that can be done in collaboration with community centers. It can be done, in collaboration with health systems that already have medical transport facilities and whatnot, right? And so what I'm really kind of, excited about building is the future of maternity care, right? And based on a model that actually fundamentally makes more sense. And whose time has come because it's kind of what reimbursements have sort of evolved in the direction of doing.
Right, reimbursements evolved, and I think you also focused on, you're one of the first players that are focused on hybrid level of care as well, as opposed to only virtual point solution for a specific area. So what was that decision? And I guess I don't know if you guys have considered venture capital or are pursuing that, or maybe have announced around, I'm not sure, maybe I missed it. But could you talk a bit about what that journey was like to raise venture capital for a hybrid level of care in the healthcare space as the market has been collapsing, and with political issues in the background and kind of what the space and the understanding has been and where the entire ecosystem can evolve and do better in this space too. And I know we're almost up on time, so that was the last question.
Okay, so I'll try to make it quick. I mean, I think the short of it is that raising venture capital, for a company like Millie, means pulling together a coalition of people, who understand how to build companies like this and understand what women really need or birthing people really need and who understand healthcare. So we had to pull it together, with sort of a, kind of the right mix of investors. But yeah, we are venture backed, so that is true. We haven't announced the round yet, but we will in the next couple of weeks, but we did sort of announce Millie as a brand launch, so that part has happened. So more to come in the next couple of weeks, so watch the space. But again, I mean, I think kind of at a broader level, I mean, I would say I think VCs are missing an opportunity when they don't look at, models that actually involve care delivery. It's the biggest part of the healthcare ecosystem. And, and I think it requires a different type of investing. And there are many, many investors, who have done that and done that even at the seed stage, right? As opposed to let's wait until we get kind of growth capital. So yeah, I mean, it's eminently possible, and I think people should.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anu. I appreciate you sharing the insights into Millie and sharing this more broadly. And we'll link to the website and excited about the big launch in Berkeley too. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.